Next will be the presidential address by our NNF President Kottayam, Dr. Joseph Patani. Sir, over to you.
A warm good evening to all of you. I am very happy to see all prominent faces of Kerala. Doctor, and we are all really honored by the presence of Dr. Ostad, Professor Emeritus in University of Norway. He has joined minutes before I joined, so I am happy how prominent and how punctual he is. I'm equally happy to see that Dr. Naveen Jain, Dr. Vyas, Nisha, Balachandran, and other all senior members are coming up. So this is our fifth section. Last four sections are actually the number of participants are very high. So this time also I expect more, and we are really honored by the presence of Ostad for this talk. I welcome everybody, and we will continue this same Neolect series so every month also. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Please join and completely involved in this talk. Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you, Patani sir. Next will be the address by our chief guest. Chief guest will be none other than Dr. Riaz, our IAP President, Kerala. Dr. Riaz doesn't need much introduction. So over to you, sir. Dr. Riaz, sir.
Dr. Riaz?
Dr. Riaz?
You cannot hear.
Hello? Hello? Riaz, sir, I think.
Hello? Hello?
Riaz, sir, are you audible?
Okay. Yes, yes. Kindly excuse me for keeping the video off. I think my network is not very good.
Yes.
Okay. So, the respected distinguished professor of pediatric research in neonatal resuscitation, Professor Saugstad, the Honorable President of Kottayam IAP, Joseph Patani sir, my dearest senior and our mentor in neonatology for all the IAPNs of Kerala, Dr. Naveen Jain, Dr. Lins Paul, Bala, my dear friend, and all in the platform. It's indeed very nice to have someone who had been doing research for long years in neonatal because neonatal resuscitation is something which is very dear to all of us. And IAP Kerala has been in the forefront of training not only doctors but also nurses and all healthcare workers in neonatal resuscitation, especially the basic neonatal resuscitation. So I think it will be a great opportunity for all of us, both the seniors as well as the juniors, to listen from the pioneer of neonatal resuscitation. We will listen to him and we will know about how to use oxygen judiciously. So all the best for the program. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that address. I think we will go ahead with the sessions. Sir, NNF state NNF in Ireland join cheyunnado? I think Nihas just joined.
Nihas is there. Nihas is there.
Dr. Nihas? Nihas, are you there? I think he's not muted.
Okay, we will go to the session, and after the session, Nihas can talk.
Yeah. So we will go ahead with the session. The session for today is the judicious use of oxygen. Is judicious use of oxygen in neonatal resuscitation and labor room, and the session will be moderated by Dr. Naveen Jain. And over to you, sir.
Good evening, friends. It's my pleasure to let the audience know who we are going to hear. Dr. Saugstad, Dr. Siddharth Ramji from India, Dr. Vento. These are great names that we have no idea how they have changed the way we go to a baby in the labor room. I don't think there has been another change in resuscitation practice in the last 50 years than how we use oxygen. As a student, when we did go to the labor room, way back maybe 96, we used to use resuscitation bags and teach everyone how to get 100% oxygen to a baby who needs resuscitation. But it is the great work of Dr. Saugstad and from India, Dr. Ramji, who are great contemporary workers, who showed the world that babies not only do not need oxygen during resuscitation, but they actually become better if you do not use the oxygen when it is not required. Dr. Saugstad, I was fortunate to hear you in person very long back at Slovenia, Ljubljana, where your student, a Korean student, was giving a very passionate lecture about her work. And I'll just share this story with some of my young friends to know what a passionate researcher of Dr. Saugstad has to be. This young girl was presenting her animal research on how she resuscitated piglets who had arrested and cardiac arrest, and they were into two groups, one group receiving no oxygen and the other group receiving oxygen for resuscitation. We were very surprised that after 3 minutes of the presentation, we heard the sound of a baby crying from behind the screen. And this young girl went back because she had delivered her baby only a week back. And she came passionately to teach and share her research work and came back and started the presentation again. She showed us, to our surprise, that the animals that were resuscitated without oxygen did actually a shade better than the ones who received 100% oxygen. So I think there isn't a greater day for me to be able to meet in person such a great teacher, a researcher who has influenced the lives of millions of babies across the world and totally changed the practices that we are doing. So over to the great teacher, Dr. Saugstad, and we will hear what you have to tell us today from your experiences and your research that you've done all your life. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jain. It was a very nice introduction, and thank you, Dr. Paul, for inviting me to this lecture. Yeah, what you mentioned, Naveen, I remember in Slovenia, and this was Anne Solovog, but actually he had a babysitter, and that was another of my fellows who was taking care of her baby when she was giving the lecture, but I had forgotten that she had to interrupt it. There's someone
Please, could you mute others, please?
If they can mute, I think it will be good for us. Okay, can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So this is the title, is oxygen a necessity in neonatal resuscitation? And I will start out with the main goals of oxygen therapy in the newborn. It's actually four different goals. And first of all, it's of course what every neonatologist knows that it is to provide sufficient oxygen to the tissues to avoid anaerobic metabolism, and further to promote brain and somatic growth and to prevent hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, and also very important for every neonatologist to minimize adverse effects. We know that oxygen is critical to life, and we also know that too much oxygen in neonates can cause oxidative stress. So this is what we call the dichotomy of oxygen. So oxidative stress, as you all are aware of, may induce organ injury and diseases. And you see, I have some references at the bottom here. And bronchopulmonary dysplasia, retinopathy of prematurity, even brain damage, brain development is affected by hyperoxia. And we know also from, you mentioned Max Vento, he did some very important studies 25 years ago showing that hyperoxia during resuscitation may injure not only the heart and the kidney, but probably also other vital organs. Well, this is just a slide showing how reactive oxygen species may influence a number of systems. I will not spend much time here, but you see here that the preterm baby is more vulnerable to oxidative stress because it has lower antioxidant defense than term babies. So reactive oxygen species, ROS, they influence the genomics, the epigenetics, transcriptomics, and metabolomics. So all these systems, and also, if I didn't mention epigenetics, very important. I will not spend time on that, but just as a background. So I just have to remove. So, okay. I can't read my whole slides. So here we have, this is a paper we published. There's someone speaking in the background here. If everybody could mute themselves, it's easier to talk. So here are a number of factors that influence the oxygenation of a newborn. And we talk about extrinsic factors, and that is about the education of the staff, equipment. Okay, it's very disturbing, this background. Is it possible to get these people muted? So I cannot talk with this background noise. I will try to.
Ranjit sir, on the mute, sir. Dr. Ranjit. Yeah, sir, you can continue, sir.
Okay, thank you. So we talk about the extrinsic factors, the staff, the education, of the equipment available, as oxygen blenders, pulse oximeters, and then we have the maternal factors, whether mother, for instance, is smoking or not, also the route of delivery and complications of the pregnancy. And we can influence these factors, but the intrinsic factors, such as the infant genetics, including the sex, temperature, we can influence, but some babies have congenital abnormalities, as you know, which influence the oxygenation status of the baby. Now, we published, this is 3 years ago, with I did it together with James Sotripoulos from Sydney, Max Vento, which I talked about already, and Julia Owie from Sydney, a survey of which... I cannot talk with all this noise. Sorry. Okay, so anyway, this is a survey and we put together some information from different publications. And you see that those who had a self-inflating bag, you can see the region. And you see that the percentage of self-inflating bag varies a lot, from 36% up to 76 or 88% in Spain. But still, there are many places where they don't have self-inflating bags. And for oxen blenders, it's even a bigger difference. And now we're talking about middle-income countries and high-income countries. So middle-income countries, 66%. In these surveys had blenders, and high-income countries, 72%. So also many centers do not have blenders. And the same is the case for pulse oximeters. Middle-income countries, 88%. High-income countries, 91%. And we also asked how many are using 100% oxygen for initial resuscitation. And you see that, for instance, on the top there, 76%, but still, this is a 2022 using 100% oxygen. But you see there's a big variation also. Now the question is, and yeah, I'm sure you know all Satya and Lakshmi, a very eminent colleague who's now in California. He asked this question: why do pediatricians and neonatologists love oxygen? And I think that there are, of course, several answers to that. But one important answer was that when Little in 1861, and the year after Mitchell, they reported brain damage in infants who had survived birth asphyxia. And Michael Oblad has written about the history of oxygen in neonatology. And he said that after these two publications, the use of oxygen in the delivery room proliferated. So everybody thought that they had to give oxygen in order to prevent brain injury. Was another factor which was of importance, and that was the introduction of the APGAR score in 1953. So when Virginia Apgar introduced her score, she had tested this out in 1,700 babies, and quite a few of these got oxygen, 20% got oxygen. And we all know that in order to achieve a high APGAR score, newborn babies have to be pink. And I don't think a newly born baby is supposed to be pink. But in order to get a newly born baby pink, you have to give oxygen. So for that reason, in many places around the world, newborn babies were given oxygen, a dash of oxygen routinely, to pink up the babies, make my APGAR score goes 10 and 10, doc. I do not want to disappoint.
त्याच्यावर मला दिसला म्हणतात डॉक्टर पोरगा नितीन नावाचा कोणतरी आहे, पण पोरगा चांगला आहे दिसायला मुंबईचा पोरगा आहे, पण पोरगा.
Yeah, so see this. So what happens if you give oxygen to a healthy newborn baby? Well, these are results from not from newborn babies, but from newborn lambs. This is a Swedish study showing the red. You see the red line here. These are newborn lambs which are resuscitated after cardiac arrest, and the red line is babies or lambs resuscitated with 100% oxygen, and blue is with air. And you see that if you give 100% oxygen, you get an enormous PO2 peak. So PO2, you see this is in kilopascals. It's very high PO2 levels. By contrast, if you give 21% oxygen, you see that the PO2 normalizes. It takes maybe two and a half minutes, but the PO2 is within the physiological range very quickly. So Satya and Lakshmi, who is also an artist, he has tried to illustrate what's happening when we resuscitate with air and oxygen. And here you see how the PO2 normalizes slowly but not that slow. If you use room air, some free radicals are generated. By contrast, if you give 100% oxygen, you get this enormous PO2 peak, and you also get this enormous production of free radicals. And we know that this affects the baby. It leads to cerebral vasoconstriction, brain inflammation. The pulmonary vascular reactivity is increased. When I started my work on this 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago now, someone stood always up and said, what about the lungs? We have to give oxygen in order to reduce the pulmonary pressure. It's now been shown that actually the opposite happens. If you give oxygen immediately after birth, you increase the risk of pulmonary hypertension in these babies. And as I mentioned already, the myocardium is damaged, and also the kidneys. And in addition, it has been associated with childhood leukemia. It's been 2 studies showing that if you give 100% oxygen the first 10 minutes of life, you may increase the risk of childhood leukemia or malignancy almost 4-fold. So this is how the world looked like before 1998. All guidelines, as I know about, they recommended to use 100% oxygen. So these babies, they were resuscitated with this PO2 peak, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. Now, very recently, just a few months ago, this book was published. Yeah, so this book was published. 50 studies every neonatologist should know about. And actually, the first chapter deals with the RESOR-2 study. Oops. Yeah. And this chapter was written by Peter Davis and Elizabeth Baker. And so they discussed the RESOR-2 study, resuscitation of asphyxiated newborn infants with room air or oxygen, which was published in 1998. The first study with room air versus 100% oxygen was published in 1993 with Siddharth Ramji as the first author, as mentioned. So Siddharth is a pioneer, of course, in this, and he was very brave when he did this study in New Delhi in the early 1990s. So, sorry, Davis and Baker, they summarized the RESOR-2 study like this. It showed it was possible to allocate newborn infants to 2 different resuscitation strategies in the seconds following birth. It facilitated further studies to answer this question with higher methodological standards, And it provided a template to address other important questions to fill the evidence vacuum of delivery room care. And the findings themselves led to important practice change, saving countless lives around the world. Well, this is a systematic review, a meta-analysis I did with Siddharth Ramji, Max Vento, and Roger Saul. It's published in 2008. And here we summarized that to that time, the 10 studies, and you see there are several studies from India here now. Ramji's first, of course, and then Rami had another one, and Bajai also had a study. So the Indians have been very active in this field. But what we were able to show was that in these 2,000 term and near-term babies, mortality was significantly decreased. if you resuscitate with air compared with 100% oxygen. There was a 30% reduction in mortality in babies who received air. And actually, when I started to test out room air in piglets in the first study with Ramji, I thought that maybe it is doable. It's possible to do resuscitation with air just as good as with 100% oxygen. I had never thought that oxygen was damaging, at least not to the extent we were able to show, for instance, this meta-analysis. So as I'm sure all of you know, in 2010, ILCOR changed their guidelines and said that in term infants receiving resuscitation at birth with positive pressure ventilation, it is best to begin with air rather than 100% oxygen. So that was, of course, a change in the paradigm. And in 2019, another meta-analysis was published by Welsford and co-workers, and basically the same data set as we used in our meta-analysis from 2008, and they showed more or less the same as we found. Odds ratio 0.73 for mortality if you use air. It's almost a 30% reduction in mortality. And these authors, they said that there will unlikely be any further studies on this topic. And with this topic, they meant term and near-term babies. So room air resuscitation reduces mortality in term and near-term babies who need resuscitation at birth. And we think that the reason is that it's less oxygen toxicity. But maybe as important was that room air resuscitation paved the way for new resuscitation programs, such as the Helping Babies Breathe program, which of course could not have been carried out with 100% oxygen. What we don't know yet exactly is preterm infants. What is the optimal initial FO2 and how should it titrate to achieve optimal saturation the first minute? So I will talk about that the rest of my lecture. How much oxygen for preterm babies? Should we ventilate very low birth weight infants or extreme low birth weight infants with a high or a low initial FO2? And this is a big issue still, I think, in modern neonatology. So look at the data we have. First, the two first randomized studies in this field, as far as I know. First was from Wang and co-workers from Neil Finer's group in San Diego in 2008, where they resuscitated preterm babies less than 32 weeks to either air or 100% oxygen. And the year after, Max Vento's group came out with a study resuscitating babies less than 29 weeks with either 30 or 90% oxygen. So here's from the Wang study, babies less than 32 weeks. And here is the heart rate. And you see that, except I don't know this big difference the first minute, but you see that there's no difference in heart rate for the rest of the study period, as you can see here. However, when you looked at the saturation, you see that the babies here, the open triangles, they had a very low saturation the first minutes of life. It took actually 6, 7, 8 minutes to reach a saturation of 80%. So these authors concluded, I think their conclusion was correct, resuscitation with room air failed to achieve our target oxygen saturation by 3 minutes of life, and we recommend that it not be used for preterm neonates. And here is Max Vento's study, babies less than 29 weeks, as I mentioned, 30 versus 90% oxygen. And here you see the saturation values first 30 minutes after birth. And you see there's actually no difference whether you start with 30% or 90%. And here in the upper panel here, the A panel, you see the difference in FiO2. And you see that it's a difference between those who start with 30% and 9%. Only the first 4 or 5 minutes of life means that after 4 or 5 minutes, they had adjusted FiO2 according to the clinical response. And again, there was no difference in the heart rate response. And they also measured the oxidative stress by looking at the ratio between when oxidized to reduced glutathione in the cord blood, day 1 and day 3. And you see here, day 1, there's increased oxidative stress in babies who received 90% oxygen. And even at day 3, there's a significant difference. So even a brief exposure of high oxygen in the delivery room, and we're talking about minutes, 2 minutes maybe, induces oxidative stress, which may last for 1 to 3 days and maybe even longer. And here they looked at some other inflammatory markers, TNF-alpha, and you see here day 1 to 7, significantly higher TNF-alpha in babies who had been exposed to 90% oxygen. Also interleukin-8, you see it's much higher. And this can be even found up to 3 weeks after birth. So I think these are important and quite dramatic results. And it tells us that low oxygen causes less oxidative stress, inflammation, and chronic lung disease. And based on these studies, ILCOR, well, in 2010, they didn't give any recommendations of which FiO2 to start out with. And the reason for that was that at that time, they didn't know. They didn't know how to titrate the FiO2 according to the saturation development. But in 2020, ILCOR states that for preterm babies, start with 21 to 30% oxygen for all preterm infants less than 35 weeks. And this is based on not least these studies by Max Vento. Now we'll see if this statement is correct. Well, here is again a meta-analysis we published. This is now soon 8 years ago, but we found all the studies. I think it was 8 studies at the time in this field, and we see that the primary outcome, which was hospital death, is not influenced whether you start with a high or a low FiO2. So then the torpedo trial came out. Julia Owe was the PI of this, and in this study was a multi-center study, but Julia Owe is in Sydney. In this study, infants less than 32 weeks gestation who needed bag and mask ventilation in the delivery room were randomized to air or 100% oxygen. And as in the meta-analysis I just showed you, there was no difference in mortality for all babies. However, when we did a secondary analysis on babies less than 28 weeks, we saw that the mortality was higher for those babies who had received room air compared with 100% oxygen. We see the relative risk is 3.9. This is highly significant. And of course, that was quite concerning to many of us. And then we looked at the primary outcome, and what we saw that those babies who had not reached a saturation of 80% or more within 5 minutes, they had a significant higher primary outcome, which was death or disability. And you can also see that they also had a significantly higher risk of intraventricular hemorrhage, grade 3 or 4. And you also can see that babies between 28 to 31 weeks also had found the same, and also that males, it's not surprising, but males also tolerated this poorer than girls. Okay. And then we did a follow-up of this material. And again, we saw that those babies who had not reached a saturation of 80% or more within 5 minutes, they had a 5-point lower cognitive score at follow-up at 2 years of age, as you can see here. And that was quite concerning. So for that reason, and that is, I think, the basis for now the recommendations that these babies should reach a saturation of at least 80%, 80 to 85% within 5 minutes. But again, we have this question, should we start with a low FiO2 and titrate up, or should we start with a high FiO2 and titrate down? And then Julia Ovi and her group, and I've been so privileged to be part of this group the last 10 years or more, 15 years actually. We had more than 700 babies, less than 32 weeks, who had been resuscitated with different FiO2s from air, 30% oxygen, 60% oxygen, 90% oxygen, and 100% oxygen. So we stratified these babies according to weeks. And this is, for instance, how the saturation develops in babies less than 29 weeks who are started with a FiO2 of 30%. And what you see here is that they start low. At 1 minute, it's the mean value is 50%, and it takes 6 minutes to reach a saturation of 80%. And this tells us that 30% is probably a little bit too low, FiO2. By contrast, if you start with 90 to 100% oxygen, the mean time to reach a saturation of 80% is 3.6 minutes. Now, there's another issue which came up some years ago based on animal studies in newborn or immature rabbits. It seems that immature infants, in order to open the glottis, they need some oxygen to open the glottis, maybe a dash of oxygen. And Janneke Dekker and Arjen de Paas in the Netherlands, they tested this out in a small randomized study. It's 5 years ago now, or it's been 6 years ago since it was published. So in this study with 44 infants, babies between 24 and 29 weeks were randomized to receive 30% oxygen or 100% oxygen. So basically what they found was that if you give 100% oxygen versus 30% oxygen, the babies had a higher minute volume, they had improved oxygenation, a shorter duration of mask ventilation, and they couldn't confirm the data from Vento 10 years earlier that there was an increased risk of oxidative stress. But they followed their babies very, very short. So I don't know. But this was at least their data. So the Dutch group, they started to resuscitate these babies with 100% oxygen right away, which I think was a little bit premature. Here we have how the saturation of the Dekker babies developed. And you see the orange line here is for babies who start with 30% oxygen. They start very low, less than 40%. And it takes time to reach a saturation of 80%. And the green line, the upper line here, the babies who received 100% oxygen. And they also start relatively low, but you see they reach a saturation of 80 within 4 minutes here. Yeah. So what I then did was that I tried to compare the data from the OE data with the Decker data. So I plotted here is the mean values. This is babies only less than 29 weeks and babies who started with 30%. So it should be very comparable groups, the Decker babies and the OE babies here. And what you see here, which is surprising, I think, the orange line here is Decker. They start much lower. I mean, even before we start ventilation, maybe, than the OE babies. And even if they get the same FiO2, they pick up much slower. It takes 5 minutes before they have picked up with the OE babies. And what does this tell us? It tells us that maybe as important as which FiO2 we start with is how we titrate. So here we have for the high FiO2 group, and again you see the green line here is the Decker baby. They start lower than the OE baby, and again it takes 4 minutes before they catch up with the OE babies. And again, this is maybe as important as as which FiO2 is how we titrate. And then a few words about the heart rate. Because Vishal Kapadia, who is now in Dallas, Texas, he looked at these 700 babies we had, babies less than 2 weeks who needed to be ventilated in the delivery room. And he looked at how the heart rate influenced or were associated with the outcome. So he said that babies who have bradycardia have a heart rate less than 100 beats per minute, and it's prolonged bradycardia if it lasts more than 2 minutes. And if it's between 0 and 2 minutes, it's transient bradycardia. So, and here he also looked at those babies who reached a saturation of 80% within 5 minutes and those who did not reach a saturation of 80% at 5 minutes. And I'd like to focus on these results here. And these are the babies who did not reach a saturation of 80% within 5 minutes and in addition had a prolonged bradycardia. And you see that odds ratio for death is 18.6. It's an enormously increased risk of death if you have the combination of hypoxemia and bradycardia the first 5 minutes of life. And that is a reason why we now recommend to reach a saturation of 80% within 5 minutes and a heart rate of at least 100 within 5 minutes. Well,
Avenna. Medicho. Aina. No,
okay. Yeah. But based on this, many thought that there's a need for more data. For instance, I haven't mentioned there was a retrospective study from the Canadian Neonatal Network. It reported higher rates of mortality and neurologic injury among preterm infants, 27 weeks of gestation less, after low oxygen recommendations were implemented in Canada, and that was 21% in these babies. So people thought that we need a new study, or maybe we could reanalyze the data we have. So what we did was that we did a new study, which is called a net motion analysis. It was a systematic review and individual participant data network meta-analysis. And this is complicated statistics. So don't ask me about this, but this was published in JAMA Pediatrics last summer. And you see that it's James Soteropoulos from Sydney is the first author. But you see that, look at all the authors, it's more or less many of those who have been active in oxygen research the last 10, 15 years. So what we did was that we had 4 studies which compared to start with intermediate oxygen, 50 to 60% oxygen versus low oxygen, 21 to 30% oxygen. And we had 8 studies comparing high oxygen, 90 to 100% versus low oxygen. We didn't have any studies comparing intermediate versus high oxygen. But with this type of analysis, it's possible to estimate if there's any difference between those, for instance, with intermediate oxygen versus high oxygen. So here we have the population, birth weight in the 3 groups, very similar, 1,070, 1,080 grams, gestation age, 28.5, 28.4 weeks, very similar homogeneous groups. And this is what we found. And when we're looking at mortality, we see that high versus intermediate, top here, odds ratio for mortality is reduced, but it's significant, but very close to not be significant. But odds ratio of 0.34. High versus low, 0.45. This is more significant, probably. Intermediate versus low, no difference. So very quickly after, Lakshmi and Rushima's group summarized this net motion study, and just what I already said, that initiation of resuscitation with high oxygen, 90 to 100% oxygen, is associated with lower mortality compared to low, 21 to 30%, and intermediate, 50 to 65% oxygen. So the conclusion of this study from ourselves was, because we had a lot of discussions within the author group of what is the significance of these data. Well, anyway, what we concluded with was that high initial FiO2 is possibly associated with reduced mortality compared to intermediate initial FiO2, but very low certainty. More evidence is required. And there was one weakness with this study, and that was many of these studies with high FiO2, they were carried out so early that we didn't, there had not been any titration of the FiO2 versus the saturation increase, which we will do today. Now, this study was followed by an editorial in JAMA Pediatrics, and this was Thomas and Elizabeth Foglia, wrote that while we focus our academic attention on results from ongoing trials to address persistent uncertainties, we should continue to focus our clinical attention on carefully titrating supplemental oxygen based on measured pulse oximetry values for preterm patients in the delivery room. Exactly the same conclusion I drew some years earlier. Now we're waiting for some studies which are testing 30% versus 60%. And there is a Torpedo 2 trial, which has just been finished. We're waiting for the results very soon. And there's also a study from Canada. But then we have, I think, there are 2 studies from India, and this one by Kumar and co-workers, and maybe some of the co-workers are attending this lecture. Then I'll be happy to get comments. So in this study, this was published just before Christmas. And in this study, babies less than 32 weeks gestation who needed resuscitation in the delivery room were randomized to 30 versus 60% oxygen. And here we have the demographics here, gestation age mean 31.3, 30.8, birth weight 1,400 versus 1,390, very similar groups. And so what it showed here is more or less exactly what we've seen already. And that is, you see here is the FiO2, and the high and the low group, they meet after around 5 to 6 minutes. Same as Max Vento found, I think, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, no, 15 years ago. But here we see the saturation trends, and you see that those babies who start with 30% oxygen, the red line here, it takes 6-7 minutes to catch up with the 60% group. But there's no difference in heart rate. So I think we've seen now a pattern that heart rates are not affected, but saturation is affected, is lower with 30% oxygen versus 60% oxygen. So the conclusion of this study was that though minute-specific saturation in FiO2 were significantly higher in 60% group, heart rate trends were comparable, and these authors did not observe any difference in need and duration of respiratory support, need of surfactant, caffeine. There was no difference in adverse events, mortality, duration of hospital stay. Another study I've just mentioned before I conclude is this very recent study from Lakshmi Nrushima's group together with Kottayam's group in San Diego. And actually what they found, they looked at how the cord clamping, the time duration of cord clamping affected these babies. We know that delayed cord clamping leads to higher saturation the first 10 minutes after birth. So what they found in this study was that the proportion of infants achieving saturation of 80% or more by 5 minutes was similar in different groups, and they compared early cord clamping with delayed cord clamping and umbilical cord clamping. So the proportion of infants achieving saturation of 80% or more by 5 minutes was similar in all groups, but FiO2 needed to achieve this goal was higher in early cord clamped infants. Means that if you delay cord clamping, you need less oxygen, and I think that is an important message. So my conclusions of this lecture is that the harms and benefits of oxygen for the preterm infant in the delivery room must be managed meticulously. Additional evidence is urgently needed, especially during the first few minutes of life when the infant's physiology is changing at its most rapid pace. High initial FiO2 is possibly associated with reduced mortality compared to intermediate initial FiO2. For preterm infants, less than 28 weeks gestation, 30% oxygen is probably too low, and 90 to 100% is probably too high. So where should we go from then before we get some more data, before we get some more guidelines? Well, this is my personal view, and I'd like to hear your opinion about that. Until we have the results of the ongoing trials, testing out 30 versus 60%, the torpedo trial, high-low trial from Canada, there's another Indian study. I suggest we should start in these babies with 40 to 60% oxygen. But I don't know what is the optimal here. And this is not evidence-based. And then a titrate to achieve a saturation of 80 to 85% within 5 minutes. So what should we do? We should follow the Goldilocks principle. And what is the Goldilocks principle? It's to find just the right amount. But when is it too little, too much, and when is it just right? And this is, of course, the important question. So hopefully we can answer this even better within the end of this year. I'd like to thank my close collaborators during Max Vento. I've been collaborating with for 30 years now, and we're also good friends. And Satya Lakshmi Nrusima is a great scientist and a close friend, Julia Ovi, and also Vissel Kapadia, as I'm sure you all know these names. So for those who are interested to read more about that, I've published this book. You can find that on Amazon.com. It's about this story. They call it Fighting for Air. And and actually it got a book award 2 years ago from now. So with this, I would thank you for your attention. Here are my two institutions. Here is the Northwestern University in Chicago and the Oslo University Hospital in Norway. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Saugstad. And we not just wish, we almost predict that you would not just get the Best Book Award, we would see you receive and your team receive Nobel at your own country for the great work that you've done, because it has changed the start of life of every human being in this world.
Thank you. Thank you. Very kind of you to say that.
And just like the last slides that you mentioned on the Goldilocks, the very first person who discovered oxygen and did the simple experiment of giving oxygen to the candle and found that it burns longer if oxygen was there in the jar. Very interestingly, he wrote on his book that I wish that when this medicine is used for people who are sick, it is used only in the right amounts so that they don't burn faster. And
it's amazing how Joseph Priestley understood this immediately when he published this in, I think it was in 1792. Yeah.
I have a question to you, sir, before we open it up to all the wonderful people who have been in the meeting today. We have seen so many studies on oxygen targets. Maybe the most one quoted recently or till last is the boost 2. And in these studies, we have had designs with issues where measuring the saturations keep fluctuating in a baby, and therefore pure data on either sides has been difficult. And I know that your work has centered most around resuscitation, but I still feel, and we talk to our students on the round, is that what probably matters is what we do as therapeutics is the FiO2 we dial, not just the numbers that we see on the screen, because what we have in control in our hand is the FiO2 and not the disease process, although we do need to target some numbers there. So have you been into work where you're trying to look at not just the saturations, but the FiO2 and outcomes in babies managed in the ICU?
Yeah, I haven't been involved myself, but there have been some studies showing that, and of course first of all, it's very difficult to, even if you have a target, it's, as all the clinicians know, it's very difficult to reach the target, and because when you are adjusting the FiO2, you have only 1 or 2 minutes to make decisions. So those studies I've seen is that you're under the target. And there was a study from Austria showing that you have to make a decision at age of 2 minutes in order to, and you cannot separate those babies who reach a saturation of 80% or not. You cannot separate them at the age of 2 or 3 minutes. But if you start later than 2 minutes, you'll probably not reach the target if you, for those babies who do not reach 80%. So it's very difficult. And you know, there's been testing out this automatic loop control. There's someone else who always, all the time, want to interfere here. Yeah. And that, maybe that will, in the future, will be systems we can use in the routine. But I, as far as I know, I don't think they're at this date, it's that we can use them routinely. But I think they will come, and of course, with artificial intelligence, I think that we will have a much better control of the oxygenation of these babies.
In your unit or in your country, do the resuscitation devices like the TP's resuscitator have color coding on them to say, look, this is green, and this is dangerous. Don't dial in this number to make
No.
it useful, friendly for nurses and doctors.
No, but I think it's a good idea, and I suggested, I know there's a patent on that, where you, on the screen, on the pulse oximeters on the screen, you get a warning if it's under or over the target. And I wish that could be commercialized. I don't know if any one of you know if this is coming, but I think that in the future it be very good for those who are doing the resuscitation, that for instance say pling, or they said if it's too high or too low, and yeah.
One more question before I open up to the audience, Dr. Saugstad. Do you have QI studies in your own unit or country where you're looking at knowledge practice of new nurses, new doctors who are actually this knowledge to practice? Does it happen consistently, and how do you manage to do that?
You mean in general or during resuscitation?
In resuscitation.
Well, there's been several studies based on video recording of resuscitation, where you can go back and you can analyze, and I think it's very helpful. I don't know if you do that routinely in your places. We don't do it routinely in my unit yet, but I think it's very useful, and because I myself, when I've carried out the resuscitation, or I've been on training courses, and I can watch myself on a video afterwards, it's so useful, because then you see really not only what you're doing wrong, but maybe what you can improve. So I think that's very useful, and I think we should sit down, the doctors and nurses, and go through every resuscitation and to discuss what could have been done better, because we can always improve, all of us.
We now invite questions from all our friends. We have many senior colleagues who are teachers and clinicians. Dr. Prakash, why don't you ask your question?
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good afternoon. Nice to meet Dr. Ola again. An
Hello.
exciting talk as usual. My query is about your opinion about the use of oxygen histograms during resuscitation and subsequently in the golden hour. Are there any studies?
In the golden hour?
Or in the resuscitation and subsequently?
Well, the only study, when you talk about the immature babies, the only study I really know about is the NeoProm study, but it starts, some after 2 hours, maybe that's too late. I don't know. I cannot recall now. Maybe I've forgotten, but I don't recall anyone who has followed them for 1 hour, for instance. Most of these studies, the studies we did, RESERT 1 and 2, we follow them for, let's say, 20 minutes. And then we didn't follow them anymore with pulse or with monitoring. So I'm not sure, but if there are any studies, but of course it would be very valuable data, especially if you could relate that to the outcome.
Okay, thank you. We routinely use during daily rounds, but not during the resuscitation and golden hour.
Okay.
The histograms, I mean, and correlate to outcomes later.
Yeah.
Thank you for your opinion.
I mean, when there's a lot of research to be done in this field. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions from our participants? Dr. Linz, you have a question?
Yeah.
Maybe while they think of the question in the mind, Dr. Saugstad, when you were being a trainee in the resuscitation room, you would have surely used more oxygen than you suggest today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when
I-
you go and you see a sick baby and very bad, do the old instincts come back and you turn off the oxygen, or now you're
Well,
rewired?
I'm retired from clinical work now, so I don't do it. But when I started my training in 1979, that's a long time ago now, and there was nobody questioned using 100% oxygen. So I used a lot of oxygen myself. But I had, based on, I did piglets or pig studies in the last part of the 1970s. And then I started to think about this with oxygen. So actually, I started very early to think that 100% oxygen might be detrimental. But of course, when I started my clinical training, I was just a young resident, and I had to follow the guidelines, which I did.
Over to Dr. Linz.
Yeah, actually, sir, I think even now in India, when in the labor room as well as in the neonatal ICUs, especially in the labor room, there is actually the reflex of the nurses or the staffs who are caring for the babies to connect the oxygen to resuscitate term babies. So if there is some sort of some amount of resuscitation required, I think even now, even in the established NICUs, in the labor room, the staffs have the nurses have a reflex to connect the tubings to the oxygen. So
Yeah.
actually, when we tell them, no, there is no need for oxygen. No, no, sir, we need oxygen. We are actually going to resuscitate a baby. So actually, I think the importance of room air resuscitation is still not reaching the staffs and the nurses even now.
Yeah, that's I'm not surprised because I know that from traveling around. And we look at this. I showed you this slide. Many places they're still using 100% oxygen, and it's difficult to understand why. I mean, because for term babies, I think it's so established. Of course, for preterm or late preterm babies, you can discuss how much data we have, but for term babies, we have quite a lot of data. So we have a job to do, all of us, I think. So.
Thanks a lot, sir. So, any of the audience, if anyone have any queries, please do ask.
Can I just make a observation?
Yes,
In
sir.
the olden days, when we were medical students, many of the government hospitals, resuscitation was done without oxygen, unknowingly. There was no oxygen in the government hospitals in many rural areas.
I know.
In the olden days.
I know. And what I heard was that many places, for that reason, they didn't even try to resuscitate, because many people believe that without oxygen, you don't need to even try because it's a waste of time.
But oxygen was not available due to lack of facilities in the government institutions.
Yeah,
throughout in the villages. But still they were resuscitating and babies survived. This knowledge of oxygen toxicity was not there in olden days.
Yeah. But you know, we have, if you look at the stillbirths, 1 million stillbirths, fresh stillbirths, and Volicado has shown that 30% of these babies can be rescued with bag and mask ventilation. And I think most of these babies were not tried even to be resuscitated some years ago, because they were just classified as stillbirths.
So besides the greatness of the country, for all the science that you contributed to the world, you're also famous for the Northern Lights. So what time is the best time to come and see your Northern Lights?
the Northern Lights, they have to come in the winter.
But very cold then.
Yeah, but we have a lot of, I don't know how many Indians, but Chinese.
I
They're
have
coming.
gone,
You've been there, yeah.
Yeah.
Chinese are coming up to the direct flights up to northern Norway just to see the Northern Lights.
Tromsø.
And it's
Tromsø.
Tromsø, yeah, exactly. And I did my internship there. The government sent me up to northern Norway. I had to do 6 months internship there, and so I've seen the Northern Light, and it's fantastic.
Dr. Lins, if there are no questions, you may want to close the session.
We are actually winding up the session, sir. So thanks a lot, sir, for this excellent session, and Dr. Naveen, sir, for the moderation, and thank you all the participants who are come and who have joined the session. And I think after the session, I hope you all will be able to monitor in the labor room regarding the resuscitation parameters, especially the need for a blender. I think many of the labor rooms, even now, they either use 100% oxygen or they just use without just room air. So I think with this session, I think there is the importance of having a blender in the labor room is also stressed.
I have to mention I was in Ethiopia at Addis Ababa 3 weeks ago, and they have a high mortality and they don't have blenders. But when I walk in the street in Addis Ababa, they have the most modern and fancy cars, but they don't have blenders. So it's a matter of priority. And I asked them, why don't you prioritize blenders instead of cars? Well, there's a different matter, but I think it's quite interesting observation because blenders are not expensive.
So same note, on a lighter note, the Indian public spends more money and technology on cricket game than on health.
Yeah. So
yeah. If is there any other comments or queries? I think
so. Just would like to leave on a very, very thankful note. Many of the youngsters, many of the seniors have been fortunate today evening to hear what has changed the way we touch every baby's life from the beginning and relive the whole story of from where it started and today where it has reached. The culmination of science in one full cycle of life, and we're fortunate to hear the story directly from you. Thank you so much for spending your day with us, sir.
thank you very kind.
Sir, Prakash sir, if you have any comments to make, yeah.
Not really. I'm just pleased to see Dr. Saugstad. I don't know whether he remembers his visit to Muscat 5 years back. I mean, 6 to 8 years back, along with Dr. Joseph Neo. We had a good trip to see. You still remember?
Yeah, there's one wonderful place, Oman. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember very
we
well.
hope to. Yeah. Inshallah, we'll hope to get you some other time. Greetings from Muscat and all my friends here.
I would love to come back to Muscat because it was a beautiful, very friendly people. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Okay. That's all. Bye-bye.
This session was actually live recorded. So this session will be, I will send the YouTube link to you all. So thank you, Saugstad sir and Dr. Naveen Dean for the session. And thank you all for the active participation in this session. Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, winding up the session. Yeah.